Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gisèle Yasmeen. I'm Executive Director of Food Secure Canada, and I'm delighted to have been invited to speak with Josh Domingues at this section, or at this breakout session on the intersectionality of food security, sustainability, and public health. I'll pass it over to Josh to introduce himself, and then we'll get into some short presentations and questions.
Hi folks, my name is Josh Domingues. I'm the founder and CEO of Flashfood, a mobile app that helps connect grocers to consumers in order to reduce food waste. And really excited and humbled to be here and excited to have the conversation with you, Gisèle.
Thank you so much, Josh. While they're loading my presentation, I just want to say it's really great to be back in Toronto, or Takaronto, as I've learned in the last few years, is the original name, Treaty 13 territory, with the Mississaugas of the Credit, also the Williams treaties with other First Nations groups, with the Chippewa, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Seneca. Something I've been trying to inform myself is on the journey of reconciliation. I learned recently about the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which is about sharing the land and the water and the resources in peace and friendship in this area. So I think that sets a nice tone to our conversation. So let me just go through the slides very quickly so that we can get to the discussion. I wanted to take a moment to introduce our organization. Food Secure Canada is a pan-Canadian alliance of organizations and individuals working together to advance food security and food sovereignty through three interlocking goals: zero hunger, healthy and safe food, and sustainable food systems. We're actually a not-for-profit. We are not a government agency. We're a civil society organization that was founded 20 years ago, actually here in Toronto, which is where the idea of our organization came to be. We do three things. So we are an information hub. So we do knowledge exchange. We facilitate a dynamic and accessible information hub to foster democratic debate on food policy. For example, we just had our third Eat, Think, Vote campaign during the federal election, which mobilizes citizens to reach out to their candidates and talk about food issues. We support a number of dynamic networks of learning and research to enhance collaboration on food-related projects. For example, the Coalition for Healthy School Food, which we're very proud to support. I'll be talking about that in a minute. And we do policy advocacy, particularly at the federal level. We advocate for policies that reflect the priorities of the Canadian food movement. We were involved in advocating for the Food Policy for Canada, which was launched in June 2019, and the creation of the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council, on which I sit, which was convened for the first time earlier this year. I just thought it would be good to define some terms. I recently went to a great presentation which indicated that, people really don't know what you're talking about when you say food security, food insecurity. It's kind of vague, nerdy language for some. So let's put some definitions on the table. The World Food Summit in 1996 defined food security as existing when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. There's also a broader concept of food sovereignty, which was established almost around the same time by La Via Campesina, which is a global peasant movement of small fishers, farmers, indigenous peoples, and others, who defined food sovereignty as the right of all peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So the question of control, who has control over their food systems and ability to feed themselves. Clearly, COVID-19 has had an impact on food security and is magnifying the structural inequalities in our food systems. And if there's a key point that I'd like to make, it's that food insecurity is primarily about social inequalities. And it has really showed the insufficiencies of social protection programs and the challenges with the dominant food supply chains. We saw as the borders thickened what happened. And our food system is so global and so rigid in a way that it was not able to adapt to this unprecedented situation. So our point is that it's really now the time to respond by strengthening local, regional, and domestic food supply chains and building more robust social protection systems so that people can access the basics. Food is an example, another is shelter or water. We cannot live without those basic necessities. Some statistics on food insecurity in Canada, they're quite shocking considering how wealthy a country we are. 1 in 7 Canadians, this was before the pandemic, was experiencing household food insecurity. It's now it's gotten worse since the pandemic, and 65% of food insecure households are people with jobs. This is what's shocking. I mean, so there really is a question of income and wages and decent work that's part of this puzzle. Black households, sadly, are 3.5 times as likely to experience food insecurity. So the City of Toronto, I'm happy to say, this is incredible, has just adopted a Black food sovereignty plan for the next several years. And the chair of our board, Milana Roberts, in her day job, has been involved with that work. Indigenous peoples also suffer disproportionately from food insecurity. Food insecurity is 3.7 times higher among the Inuit, 2.7 times higher among First Nations off reserve, and 2.2 times higher among Métis. This is the legacy of colonialism, unfortunately. This is really about dispossession from land and control over their food systems. And the Indigenous food sovereignty movement is something we are committed to supporting as best we can in a respectful way and through the lens of reconciliation. So what are the root causes of hunger? Food insecurity is a measure of material deprivation, whether we're talking about Canada or we're talking about the global South. It's not about food supply. As you well know, Josh, there is plenty of food out there. So it reflects an imbalance about the availability of financial resources and necessary expenses. Housing is a big factor. When housing is very expensive, there are some really tough choices to be made. Daycare would be another, transportation, et cetera. So these are the challenges and why we are advocating for a universal livable income floor. So what are the policy priorities? I just talked about a universal livable income floor. There should be a threshold, social protection floor below which no Canadian can fall or no person in Canada can fall. Increasing access to healthy local food. Healthy food should not be only for the wealthy. And what the studies that we've done show that people who don't have the resources to eat healthy food, they still want to eat healthy food. It's not about not being knowledgeable or not caring about healthy food. It's about not actually having the income or the means to feed themselves and their families healthy food. And unfortunately, diet-related disease, according to Heart and Stroke Foundation, is costing us $26 billion a year. So we can't afford to not follow the healthy eating strategy and have more balanced diets and really, look at junk food and the marketing to kids and all of these big issues that are really taking us down the wrong path. Healthy eating strategy, we've talked about it. This is something we really need to mobilize for. And we need targeted and distinct responses for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's not a one size fits all. We also need women-friendly solutions. We need community-based solutions. So communities need to have control over the policy solutions and the programs and the conditions that are going to affect their access to food. We have a right to food framing. So we do see food as a basic human right, and Canada did sign on to the right to food back in the 50s. Housing activists have been successful in getting the right to shelter in federal statutes. We really want to push for that to be recognized. I have heard certain cabinet ministers recently say, as recently as April, that food is a right and public policy should stem from that fact. Unfortunately, what we have are charity-oriented solutions that are reinforcing social inequalities as opposed to taking us down the path to dignity and the right to food. So that is something that we are quite committed to pushing for. And we need urgent global food system transformation. I mean, this is screaming at us around the world. Study after study after study. The recent World Food Systems Summit, despite the criticisms and the counter summits that were organized, there was a general point of agreement that something has to change. Food is the single most important lever for human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. When we look from production through distribution to consumption and all those issues, we have an opportunity here to turn the system around and not just address root causes of hunger, but also some of our environmental challenges. We're talking about food loss and waste today with you, Josh. We have to view this issue in an integrated way, not in a siloed way as it's currently being looked at by policymakers because of the way things are structured. Some of the things that we're working on, the Sustainable Development Goals, Canada signed on in 2015 to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That commits Canada to zero hunger, achieving food security and improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable food production and agriculture by 2030. This is in 8.5 years. So the clock is ticking. And we need to immediately advance a national school food program, ensuring that it is healthy and universal and developed in collaboration with provinces, territories, key stakeholder groups, Indigenous leaders, et cetera. Other countries have done this. We are the only G7 country without such a program. That could be a tool for food systems transformation in many, many ways, and there's a whole groundswell movement around this, which we are supporting. That is it for me. Please stay in touch. I hope I haven't taken too much time. I want to pass it over to you now, Josh. And thank you very much to the audience and the sponsors and the organizers for putting on this event.
Well, Gisèle, that was incredible, and a whole bunch of topics were covered, right? And I'll start. So what I'll do is I'll share who I am, some of my background, what I'm working on, and then I'm just going to go through a few topics that'll address some of the things that we're talking about and some of the information that I have on it. But I'll start off by saying the issues that we're talking about are so complex. And basically, how do people get food that's healthy consistently in all different areas? Like, that's just, for whatever reason, I guess I'll go through some of them, very difficult. My name is Josh Domingues. I'm the founder CEO of Flashfood, which is a mobile app that helps grocers reduce food waste. So instead of throwing out perfectly good food, they make it available on the Flashfood app at 50% off. We send a notification out to our users. They see the deal through their phone, pay through their phone, and they pick it up in the store the same day. And I've got a couple of topics here that I'm going to talk about, and I'll frame it initially. So the commerciality of how food gets to people. Then we'll go through lack of access, the operational challenges of food waste through the value chain, and how finance gets in the way of food waste in a lot of ways. The last thing I'll talk about is consumer habits and what drives some of this food waste. So the first thing on the commerciality of food waste and how it gets to people. In Canada in particular, I mean, a lot of our food that we obtain comes from the grocery store. And you have basically 3 or 4 different grocery chains across the country. So obviously like Loblaws, Sobeys, Metro, Walmart, and Costco. That's basically what we have here, pretty oligopolistic. And when you have that few amount of companies providing the entire country with food, you're just bound to get into challenges and to have differences of opinions, differences of incentives, and also throughout the value chain, areas that need to be reduced or optimized in order for these businesses, because it's all private sector, to capitalize on in one way or another. And from my lens, private sector, business, like you need to make money to be able to continue as a business, and that needs to be sustainable. And what that leads to, which is horrifying, and I guess a little bit about my background, 5.5 years ago, I quit my job to start the company. I knew nothing about food and these challenges before then, and I'm coming at all of this from a lens of somebody who really was uneducated in the problem. And now to be fast forward 5.5 years later, it's really heartbreaking and sad and scary to see different communities across the country not have access to healthy food. And even more importantly than that, what scares me is the impact of a kid growing up either without having meals, which one, like, imagine that. Like, if I'm not having dinner, I'm grouchy. Like, my wife knows that really well, you know? Like, if I don't eat, I'm grouchy, and I don't have a long attention span to begin with, and if I'm not eating, that even shortens. So imagine being a child in school, not having access to any food, not having access to healthy food, and then not knowing when your next meal is going to come. That is just such a big challenge, especially if you grow up and that's your norm. And how do we solve that? And the only way to solve some of these things you've highlighted on, but it's really just to provide access. And somewhere in the value chain within Canada of not that many companies that are moving a lot across all this food, and it's not just the grocers, there's like few producers, there's few importers, like there's not many organizations. How do we target different areas in a commercially viable way so that it's sustainable as a business? And I think that's just a really difficult thing to think about. The other thing is the problem gets even harder at different communities. So the lack of access, even if we had programs in place of, I don't know, a family in a remote area of the country, if there's an organization or a structure that allows them to have access to healthy food, how do they get there? And how do they, I mean, if you're in a remote place and it's the middle of winter and like there's a big snowstorm, roads are closed, like that is also just such a difficult challenge to think about. And then even further, as we think about where we obtain our food, generally in areas of the country that have lower income brackets or deal with lack of resources, you have less opportunity and things are further away from you and it's just harder to physically get to places. So how can these things be solved in, whether it's a not-for-profit, whether it's a charity, a viable, consistent, scalable solution? And that is, like, we really need Canadians and innovators to come up with different things, and we need people in government to have openness to policies that'll drive these things faster. And it's one thing to put targets in by like certain dates. In my experience, that rarely ever happens. I mean, you look at any of the things around climate change that are happening right now and like countries saying they're gonna reduce X by X date, like if you don't have an action plan to get there, how are you gonna get there? Now, I'll get into a few more detailed things, and I'll start with the consumer habits and why that drives food waste. And then I'll end a little bit on finance and how just financials in general get in the way of this. So our app, we deal with grocery stores. Unfortunately, they get rid of quite a bit of food on a daily basis. And there's several reasons for that. One of the reasons is if a grocer wants to make all this food available for donation, who picks it up, who drops it off, who pays the price, who guarantees the safety? Very, very logistical, big challenge. And there are some organizations across the country that are doing incredible jobs at taking food from one place, bringing it somewhere else, giving more people access. And for the most part of my experience, grocers, massive food companies are open to this, right? Nobody wants to throw out food. Everybody hates it. From the top executives to the part-time worker in the store, nobody likes the feeling of it. And how to get that to folks in need, particularly from the grocery side, we see it because that's where consumers are driving, and it's gonna take more organizations in local areas to do that. The next part is just how commerce gets in the way of, on the consumer side, when all of us go grocery shopping, we're always reaching at the back for whatever has the longest shelf life. And what that does is it moves the near-dated stuff to the front. And as consumers, we don't take it. So what the grocer has to do in this example is pull that food from the shelf a little bit in advance so that we're always buying stuff that has a few days of shelf life. In addition, if we go buy a watermelon and there's one on the shelf, as consumers, we assume it's the worst one, so we don't take it. So the grocer has to overstock the shelves so that we get selection. And what all of these consumer side things lead to is over-packaging of food. We have way too much, we're buying too much, we're throwing out. Most of our food waste comes from our fridges. We buy too much and we throw it out. And it really is just the thing that we can all do today to drive the biggest impact, particularly on the environmental impact of food waste, is just stop throwing out food, eating what you have. Like, full stop, that's it. Now, the last thing that I'll touch on before we go back and forth with a few questions is just how finance gets in the way and big business really gets in the way of driving some of this food waste. And it's overproduction. We have so much food, and you have these companies that are public companies that are incentivized to continue to grow, and what that means is to produce more food, to get more food to different places, and it's just too much. It really is just flat out too much. So at one point, how does this value chain reduce the amount of loss in different ways so that you have, like, economics 101, a balance of supply and demand in a way that the price point matches? And with some of the things that have happened through COVID and the government assistance that's come in, which was, in my opinion, very necessary and required because people are in a really difficult time through the pandemic, even worse coming out of it with unemployment rates and such. But it's driving inflation, it's driving the price of food even higher. So it's just, we're in a really fickle time and a really difficult time to think through some of these challenges. And again, I'm really grateful to be here to talk about it with you, Gisèle, and love the work that you're doing. So happy to go into questions now.
Thank you, Josh. That was great. No notes. I'm just so impressed.
Yeah.
And I'm, so glad that we're, 10 years ago, there wasn't much discussion on food loss and waste. And I know, experts like Digvir Jayas at the University of Manitoba, he was trying for 20 years to get people to start talking about this. And finally we are. And there is a whole movement around this. And we really have to do something about this. And my favorite thing is that it finally kills the argument that food insecurity is about somehow, lack of supply. So it really does kill that. There are a lot of pitfalls, though, about equating food loss and waste as a solution to food insecurity, which it isn't. Not in the long term, at least. But what I'm wondering in terms of prevention of food loss and waste, you've touched on this already a bit, but in terms of preventing and reducing food loss and waste, particularly in Canada, where do you see the role of the private sector to really kind of drive that?
Yeah, and I can only speak from my experience really on this, but you're so right in that, we're talking about overproduction, we're talking about food insecurity, we're talking about food waste. These are all very different topics that are intertwined. And if we have so much, how come people aren't getting it, right? It just doesn't make sense. In a lot of instances, the private sector is so important. You need to be able to build financially viable solutions. And it's not just the private sector, whether it's an organization like Second Harvest that's doing so much across the country and different food banks. We have a lot of private funders that are funding some of these initiatives that are driving a reduction in food insecurity, you would hope in most cases, which I think would be true, which is why the organizations are running. And also in innovations like ours and others across the country that are tackling whether it's food waste, whether it's food insecurity, whatever it is. But the reality is, for the problems that we're seeing, a lot of problems in the world that tie back to the environment, I think it has to be done in a commercially viable way. And what I mean by that is one of the big parties involved financially benefits from it happening. And when you can unlock that, then you can unlock a value prop to a whole slew of different stakeholders. So if you look at Flashfood, for example, we've unlocked a financially viable way. It's not the biggest growth driver, but a financially viable way for a grocer to partner with us. And what that's done is it's allowed consumers to save 50% on their groceries, which is really meaningful and has been. Some of our shoppers have saved over $20,000. And we hear stories often of people who couldn't afford to feed their kids healthy, fresh food without Flashfood. And then you think about the environmental impact. So to step back a little bit on food waste and why we're going into that, when food gets thrown out, most times it ends up in a landfill, gets covered by other garbage. When it rots, it doesn't have oxygen, that produces methane gas. So the statistic is if international food waste were a country, it'd be the third leading cause of greenhouse gas emission behind the US and China. So it's not cars and factories, it's food waste. Well, we have so many people that need food, that are hungry. It's why is this a problem? So I think that it's a combination of, back to your question, the private sector and innovative solutions, and in addition to that, the private sector continuing to fund organizations that are non-private that are solving this problem, because there's not just one magic bullet. And incentivization in Canada, this is probably the forum to do it. There's a food loss challenge in Canada that the government has funded, and they basically have this contest where a whole bunch of people can apply, and whatever you're doing that can reduce food waste can be a submission, and the government will fund the top submissions and ideas and like methods of reducing food waste. Flashfood to date has diverted over 30 million pounds of food from landfills while saving Canadians millions of dollars on their groceries. And there were about 400 submissions to this contest, and we were not one of the top 20. So if you're gonna build these government programs, you need to support the organizations and the initiatives that are driving results. And I went back and forth with the people who negated us. And look, I'm a startup founder. Everybody tells me no all the time. Can we have money? No. Can we have a new grocer? No. Do you want to join the company? No. I hear no all the time. And for this one, it really hurt because we're solving it. And we're the private sector, and it's not an idea of how we're going to get to X result by X date. It's like, this is what we're doing. So I just think, I don't know how to solve that problem. And I think a collection of private sector and public sector, we got to help each other.
Well, and plus your app is, people are accessing the food with dignity.
Yeah.
In a way that they have control. It's not a handout or
Yeah.
it's one of my colleagues was saying it's a bit like, I go to secondhand stores. I buy clothes at secondhand stores, right? So,
yeah.
And it's, it's a dignified way of accessing food that would otherwise go into the landfill. So,
and it gives people selection.
Yeah.
I've been fortunate I haven't had to do, and we won't talk about the business, but I just mean to bring it back to the question, private sector, public sector, whatever we're doing on whatever initiatives, we just need to be supportive of each other because it's so important. You kill things that are going well if they don't have support, really.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I've got one for you, and I guess we'll go back and forth. And this is not just all off the top. I have my cell phone here, and my notes are on my cell phone. So Gisèle, when you think about your career, the work you're doing in the space, and the good and bad that you've seen, why isn't our government regulating food waste in similar ways as they are in other countries, particularly France?
Thanks for that question. I don't know as much about food loss and waste as you, Josh. You're the expert, but I know that France and a lot of European countries also are just doing incredibly progressive things in the food sector in general. And for example, France has this new law called Egalim, which supports small farmers to move towards agroecology and more sustainable food production methods. And they've got school food, and on food loss and waste, I know there are a number of things that they've been doing that you were just informing me about before this session, like actual real incentives to deal with the root of the problem. I think we've got to look at these international examples. Obviously, the French system is different. We have a federal system in Canada, and a lot of our issues. So there's a federal provincial side of things. It's impossible to trade between provinces. That's a whole other thing.
Why is that?
Definitely the context is different, but we need to take inspiration from these examples that are happening around the world. And I think, citizens are driving a lot of this change too in Europe, and citizens are pushing for sustainable labels, for example, sustainably produced foods. They're pushing for all kinds of things that I think are resulting in public policy and programming that is responsive. So I do think the onus is also on us in civil society, as citizens, as consumers who care, to put our money where our mouth is if we care about climate change, if we care about food loss and waste, if we care about hunger, whatever it is, that we want to get our policymakers to have the right framework and push the private sector. Same with the overpackaging, as you were saying. So we shouldn't be having so much overpackaged, over-processed, highly processed food to start with, but if you are going to have packaging, what about more ecological packaging, et cetera? So, that's really the direction. I've got to say the youth are leading on this. So they give me confidence.
I was actually like, one of the things that, so where you see change drive the most around anything environmental, in my opinion, is when money starts to flow a certain way. So when brands are coming out and actively talking about not providing clothing that's just fast fashion, it's going to be tossed or burned.
Yeah.
You know, like when you buy something and that company plants a tree. Basically, like where our consumer dollars can go is starting to more meaningfully dictate what companies and governments are doing. And it affects elections.
Yeah.
I mean, like, and that is really exciting to see, and a lot of it's coming from our youth as they get older, which is, thank God.
The buy social movement, I don't know
Yeah.
if you've heard of
Yeah.
buy social.
Yeah.
It's every time you make a purchase, being conscious of, what is that impact? Also investment, socially responsible, environmentally responsible investment. I've got another quick one for you.
Yeah.
You've told us about your app, which is great, and I want to check it out myself. But what about sustainable livelihoods? Like, what about, your kind of business model and opportunities for women and youth and Black, Indigenous people of color? Like, do you see some opportunities there in terms of, trying to tackle the issues that you're trying to face? How do you build that capacity and those entrepreneurship and sustainable livelihoods that could come out of it?
There's a couple of things to pull out of the question, and it's a good question. I'm glad the topic is being brought up. For Flashfood and the business, it's for people that buy groceries, and it's a 50% discount, right? So there's like no, and we partner with grocery stores. So we're in grocery stores, and there really is, you can't really target it at any one market. It's whoever wants to use the app can use it. It's accessible, which is something that like I feel really good about, and it's just really cool about our business. And typically like consumer tech that is built in predominantly Silicon Valley now that we use is all for folks to spend more money, to get convenience, to save time. Uber Eats, Uber, Amazon, like anything, you're paying more to have more of your time back. Whereas Flashfood is just naturally for folks that are willing to go out of their way to save money. And there's more of those folks, and that's one of the really cool byproducts of what we're building as a company. And as a business, like try to have we're up to 80 people now. We try to have as many perspectives from as many different backgrounds as we can in the company consistently. So like as a founder, it's been like not challenging. You have to be self-aware to build a business that way, because it's very easy to hire or interview. And one of the folks on my team, her name's Steph, she's our chief product officer. She really challenged me early because I was trying to get better at this and understand it better. And how do you open up the company so you'll have people coming in from different places and different backgrounds? And she's like, one of the biggest ways to do it is to open up the candidate pool. And how you open up the candidate pool is by changing some of the language and by posting in places that otherwise wouldn't have jobs like this posted. And it's just like taking a step back to even think about those little subtleties makes such a big difference for somebody in a different community that otherwise wouldn't apply to a job at a company like Flashfood. So there's so many different ways that we can go around what you're thinking in the question, particularly like people that don't have as much access to do things that are entrepreneurial or solution oriented. And I don't know how you provide more access to some of the folks in these communities. And also, my lived experience is a lot different than other folks' lived experiences. I won the hereditary lottery in a lot of ways. I was born a white male, and I was born in Canada. So I can't even fathom or understand what some folks will have had to deal with growing up. I mean, my dad's an immigrant. My mom has part of her background is Indigenous, but she's removed enough that she hasn't dealt with that in her life. And I guess my dad still barely speaks English, I joke. But like he would have dealt with some things as an immigrant. But all that comes back in the same way that like consumer spending on things that are environmental drives change. It really is how we treat each other. And like just treat each other kindly with like empathy and listen to people and give folks opportunity. I don't know how you foster that in a way where somebody coming up who doesn't have a lot of opportunities is willing to take an even greater risk, because folks in that category generally, they're not looking at like the upside, they're looking at reducing downside. If they make one mistake, that's it. Like, and I don't know how you solve that problem in a society, but I do know that at Flashfood, we're going to continue to have folks from all kinds of different places. Tough question, folks. That was a tough question. I got one. If you could wave a magic wand and have Canadians truly understand one thing as it relates to any of the problems that you see in your career, what would it be?
You know, that is such a great question, and it's something that I learned when I was 17 years old, 1983. You know how old I am? And that was that, you know, we can solve world hunger. It is totally doable. It is not about too many people, not enough food. It is about entitlements. It's about access. It's about structural inequalities. It's about poverty alleviation or poverty elimination. And that's what the issue is. It is, you know, and we really need to shift the discourse on this. We live in a world of plenty.
Yep.
And we are not managing our beautiful world of plenty as we should be, and we are not, you know, sharing the resources of this blue planet as we should be. We're not taking, and we are destroying our productive assets as we go forward as well, and we can't afford to do that. So I'm a mom. I care about the next generation, and you know, we really need to get our act together and you know, transform this food system so that we have a viable planet to live on, but also that, you know, we take care in a dignified way these social inequalities.
Completely agree.
Yeah. I know we have audience questions. I'm wondering if, I think we already, the one I was going to ask you, we already took care of. So maybe, I don't know if you want to ask my last question or if you want to go straight to the audience questions, Josh?
Yeah, let's go with the audience questions. My questions aren't that great anyway.
So maybe I'll read it out. In many countries and even within households, food insecurity and obesity coexist. Can you explain this paradox? Oh goodness. Yes, that is true. I mean, a lot of the food that's being foisted upon us, junk food, highly processed, ultra highly processed, cheaply produced, high starch and fat content, is actually obesogenic and not necessarily nutritious. And so this is a symptom of the broken society and food system that we're in, that those who are, you know, who are poor or structurally disadvantaged, often women, Black, Indigenous people of color, you know, working class people are not able to afford healthy food. So as a result are poorly nourished, and it affects the metabolism. At the same time, there is an anti-fat shaming movement that is growing, and I really do support that movement because, you know, we need to get to the root of the issues and not blame those who are, you know, struggling as a result of this situation and the chronic health issues that are coming from it. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
It's a really difficult question. Essentially, like, how do you have food insecurity and obesity? And I think what we'll uncover in the future is that mass-produced food typically comes from, like, big companies, and it's the cheapest food that you can buy, and it's produced primarily with like corn and cornstarch and corn byproducts and sugar. And those foods are actually highly addictive. Like, it's very difficult. If you ever try to get off of sugar, like, good luck. It's very, very difficult to do. And generally, when you don't have enough resources financially, you're gonna go to whatever is the cheapest available, and that ends up being non-healthy food. So it's like the two can coexist because of essentially that reason. Now you'll also have the other side of like obesity existing because you have too much and you're just eating too much, but that's how you have both of those coexist. And it's like, when you have less options. And those small options of purchasing food or even obtaining food from a food shelter or whatever is generally reduced options that are less healthy.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. The corn and the high fructose corn syrup, huge resources in the world devoted to growing all of that. It goes into soda pop. And you know, all of the issues around child nutrition that come out of that as well, which are really quite alarming. Yeah.
And we have the food pyramid and stuff, but like I really wasn't educated on food and nutrition until I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
And I really understood the impact of what that has on my attention span, on my mood, on like a whole bunch of different things. So I just I don't know how to solve for any of these things because they're really complex.
Yeah.
But this is how they can coexist.
Well, absolutely, yeah. There are solutions. Marketing to kids, for example, restrictions. Some, children are a target, right, for junk food, for high sugar content, the rest of it. And apparently our kids are not getting their, required portions of fresh fruits and vegetables every day. So it's just a real tragedy. Even UNICEF has called us out on that. Should we go to the second question then from the audience?
Yeah, the second is, what effect is climate change having on world hunger? And I could start. Places in the world that are being the most impacted by climate change generally are closer to the equator and oftentimes have less to begin with. And so when you have obviously like the result of climate change, you'll have tons of storms, a whole bunch of negative impacts, droughts, floods, and it makes it, whatever the multiple is, more difficult to grow and produce food in these places. So what we're seeing and what we're projecting to see is that climate change will have a bigger impact on marginalized communities across the world, which is, again, like just so sad. It's so sad to think about the impact of our decisions and how that affects so many people.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Whatever calamity it is, the poor are always disproportionately affected. And certainly a lot of food in the world, or most food in the world, is produced by very small farmers, actually. And when you're in that kind of vulnerable situation and your productive assets are being negatively affected, then that has a negative impact on your livelihood, on your food security. But you could say it for a number of other areas as well. Maybe I'll read the third one then,
Sure.
Josh. How can humanitarian and development support be better coordinated? Where has this worked well? Well, that's the number one question right now. Is all of the international work is pointing to, the disaster that's coming out of COVID-19 in terms of rising levels of hunger and food insecurity. Again, it's a bit like the charity argument that we made. In the short term, yes, there are humanitarian charity type approaches, but ultimately these are broader social justice issues that need to be addressed in terms of moving from a development paradigm, a kind of colonial and top-down development paradigm, to a social justice and community empowerment and more equal distribution of resources on a global level within Canada, but also on a global level. And that's where that coordination needs to happen. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Josh, but there are examples like Kerala, for example, in India, where there have been investments on building that capacity on the ground, and you have much better social indicators, even that compared to certain parts of Canada in states such as Kerala.
I would say that when we have time constraints around collectively solving a problem, as people, we're so much more effective. And if you think about, like, anytime there's a hurricane somewhere and a country is really depleted, or a flood somewhere, and all the humanitarian efforts that are driven to like help folks in need there, and irregardless of like what you think about the outcome of vaccines and taking a vaccine, the fact that we were able to create a vaccine at such a record timing, like when our backs are against the wall, we're really good at collectively working together to solve problems. And so I think we've seen time and time again humanitarian efforts be really successful and have support from governments and other organizations. And it's just interesting to think about the question, because it really does tie in like urgency. And climate change is urgent, and it's becoming more and more urgent, and people are seeing the impacts of it a lot more drastically in their own lives. I was driving earlier this summer in the morning, and I live in Toronto. I was driving just outside the city, and I remember like for 2 days in a row, it was kind of cloudy, and there was like a fog, and it's because there were forest fires in Ontario. And I just remember thinking, like, I'm not in California. And you see it in California, you see it in Greece and all these other places. And it doesn't become personal until you really see it in your own life. And I remember thinking, like, I live in Canada and this is happening here. Like, we are in a bad state globally on climate change. And I'm really encouraged by a lot of the things that folks are doing now versus even 10 years ago around climate change. And I'm equally, if not more, encouraged by the financial system and money that is now flowing into ESG companies. You have BlackRock, the biggest investment fund in the world, which, think of corporations how you want, but about a year and a half ago, their CEO came out and said, we're not going to invest any of our further assets into any company that isn't taking some sort of environmental lens. And when money at the top starts to flow this way, because from a business perspective, it makes sense, and like these businesses are going to prosper, I think that's where you start to see real change. So on the humanitarian piece and just the coalition of people, I think when we do have scarcity and time constraints, we do a really good job, and we've shown that time and time again.
Absolutely.
And on that, we'll jump to the next question. So what are 3 things that need to happen in order to reach SDG 2?
You want me to take that on?
Yeah, because I don't know what
So
that is.
Sustainable Development Goal number 2 is the zero hunger, improve nutrition, and transition to sustainable food systems. So it's a little bit of a combo. And yeah, I would have an answer to that, and I'm assuming it's with respect, well, there's the world, of course, but there's, let's stick with Canada for now and be a little more modest. And the 3 suggestions I want to make are all in the context that there's no one size fits all, and that communities need to have control. There needs to be kind of a community control, not a top-down approach, and particularly with First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities who should be controlling their own food systems. But one that I mentioned is the universal livable income floor. So the federal government and the provinces need to work together so that we have, again, there's a floor through which nobody can fall, or no household can fall in this country. Like, it's not, we have to agree that it's not acceptable to not be able to put good food on the table or have a roof over your head, for that matter. And that has to be non-negotiable, and it is doable. There are, various coalitions out there that have costed and done, scenarios where existing program envelopes can be better structured, and, we've seen what was possible too during the pandemic. The second, which I also mentioned, is a school food program for Canada. Yeah. Again, that Korea has done this. Korea has used school food as a driver to meet multiple benefits, to transform to more agroecological food production, to support sustainable livelihoods, to improve child nutrition, to, it's not a solution to, hunger, but it makes a difference. So when it's well designed and it's not in the control of the junk food companies, and is more community-based, like, there's some real transformation potential, and I'm sure there'd be less food loss and waste as well. Mm-hmm. And the third is to really provide incentives. We did see in Budget 2021 allocations for transition to more ecological methods of food production. Mm-hmm. And that really needs to push. So Farmers for Climate Solutions, for example, is doing great work in this regard, but we need to do the same for fisheries. It's no longer acceptable to destroy the soil and kill the bees and everything else that's happening. We're mortgaging our future. Yeah. So those are the 3 things that I would say need to happen.
So as a startup founder, and going through the journey of like starting with nobody on the team and then getting to the point now where we're at, you basically only get to the point that we're at in a business by having a hypothesis, testing it, and doubling down on it, and driving results. Like, that's it. And I don't understand and can't fathom, with the resources that we have in Canada, why some problems haven't been solved, as simple as clean drinking water. Like, you have communities in Canada that don't have access to drinking water, and we have budget that's being set aside to hypothesize how to solve some of these problems. It just...
Or grow food on Mars, that's a good one.
Yeah, give folks water. Take the money that we're deploying over there and just put it in the investment that you need to give people clean water. How is that even in question? So, and then other things that we're doing that are working, double down. That's where you place your bets on things that are working to hit targets, or that's how you accomplish targets on the way to accomplishing goals. So this is such a tough thing to think about, and it really frustrates me because as I'm learning and developing in my journey of being a CEO, you learn that when you step away from doing things, your job predominantly becomes holding folks accountable, whether it's your board, whether it's other stakeholders, whether it's your team. And I think the only way that we hit these goals is as scary as this thought is to have government hold itself accountable for what we're doing. And again, that's not a bias to like any political party. It's really whoever's the leader of what we're trying to accomplish in any of these goals, who actually like has their career based on these targets, hold these folks accountable so that they can hold the others that are driving these results and controlling some of this spend accountable. Outside of that, like we've just talked about half of the ideas that can make a big impact right now. Like it's not like we can't come up with the ideas, they're there. So just start doing them. And yeah.
Well said. I know we can't get to the rest of the questions. There's some good ones there. Black Food Sovereignty Plan in Toronto. Look it up. It's in the papers. There's Anand Laloli and others who've been working 20 years for this. But I think maybe I'll just offer a few closing remarks then, if that's okay. You know, never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. It is about implementation science, isn't it? About making things happen. But this has been a fantastic session, and thank you so much, Josh, for your eloquent remarks. And it's been a real privilege to be here with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Gisèle. Likewise, and I'll take that compliment with me. Really appreciate it.